Indians in Kenya are citizens and residents of Kenya with ancestral roots in the Indian subcontinent. Most are found in the major urban areas of Nairobi and Mombasa, with others living in rural areas. When talking about Indians in Kenya, we must talk about a man called Vasco da Gama. The first record of Indian diaspora in Kenya was by Vasco da Gama in the 15th century. He was a Portuguese explorer who traveled around Africa and India. In the same way, Indians in Kenya genetically decline native Kenyans, and black and white in America would always be like oil and water. After Kenya achieved independence from the Britain in 1963, the Indian population in Kenya declined from 179,000 in 1962 to 139,000 in 1969 and to 78,000 in 1979. Vasco da Gama recorded entering Indian merchants along the coast of East Africa in the late 15th century. In Malindi, that's a place in Kenya, he obtained the service of a Gujarati-speaking sailor to navigate ships across the Indian Ocean to Calicut. The Portuguese soon came to monopolize trade across the Indian Ocean and displaced the existing Arab commercial dominance in the region. Although this affected Indians' commerce with East Africa, Indians were the accountants and bankers for the Portuguese as they had been for the Arabs. By the early part of 19th century, small numbers of Indian merchants could be found settled across the trading post of East Africa. Their interests were enhanced when Said bin Sultan, the Sultan of Muscat and Oman, subjected to the emergence of British naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean and direct British political support for Indian merchants along the East African coast, adopted a series of favorable policies towards Indians in the region. In 1887, the British East African Association was founded with its base in Bombay, that's in India. The following year, the association was given a royal charter, becoming the Imperial British East African Company and moving its base to Mombasa, that's in Kenya. Though now based in Africa, the company had a strong Indian orientation, employing guards, police officers, clerks, and accountants from Bombay. Again, East African Protectorate significant Indian migration to modern-day Kenya began following the creation of the East African Protectorate in 1895. The Protectorate took over the assets and personnel of the Imperial British East Africa Company and hence its Indian orientation. The rupee, which was the Indian currency, was instituted as the currency of the Protectorate and legal system became an extension of the Indian law. But initially, British officials envisioned developing Kenya as the America of the Hindu. Considering Indians as sub-imperialist agents of civilization in the region, among the local Indian ethnic populace, the vast majority of the administrative roles were filled by Konkani, Gohans, Parsils, and Gujaratis, whilst the ranks of the British officered police and army mainly consisted of Punjabis. Between 1896 and 1901, some 32,000 indentured laborers were recruited from India to construct the Uganda Railway. And Uganda, as we know, is in the East African coastline. And Uganda share one common border with Kenya. So the principal recruiting center was Lahore, which coolies were engaged from the surrounding villages and sent to Karachi in special trains to catch especially chartered steamers of the British India Steam Navigation Company. Construction of the railway was a remarkable engineering feat. However, approximately 2,500 laborers died during construction. About 4 deaths for each mile of track laid, and the project was notorious for the 2 servo maniators. Once the railway was completed, some of these laborers voluntarily settled in the protectorate and brought families from India. The railway opened the interior to trade, and many soon began migrating away from the coastal cities. Over the following years, large numbers of Gujaratis and Punjabis migrated freely, seeking to utilize new economic possibilities in the protectorate. These migrants often came with family members or members of the same village or caste. Asian settlers were soon joined by European farmers. From 1902 onward, were given large tracts of land in the White Highlands. The cooler highlands seemed as more suitable for European settlement, were reserved by the government for the sole occupation for Europeans. Asian exclusion from these favorable lands caused friction between Asian and Europeans, which would last for decades. Many Asians instead settled in the new town of Nairobi, which from 1905 became the capital of the British Protectorate, and where, unlike black Africans, Asians were permitted to reside legally. One of the most significant early pioneers was A.M. Jivanji. In 1890, his company A.M. Jivanji of Karachi was awarded the contract to supply labor for the building of the Uganda Railway. He subsequently went on to establish himself as a preeminent Asian businessman in the new colony. He established Kenya's first newspaper known as The Standard in 1901 and was the first known white to be elected to the Legislative Council in 1910. Such was his success that in 1904 it was estimated that he owned half of Mombasa and the greater part of Nairobi. In 1900, the Mombasa Indian Association was established on the initiative of L.M. Sel and with the backing of wealthy businessman Ali Dinar Visram and the Jivanji brothers, and became the first political organization in the protectorate to represent the interests of the Asians. Regional branches later emerged, including in Nairobi in 1906, which soon became more influential than the Mombasa Association. To coordinate the aims of the different branches, the British East African Indian Association was formed in 1907. However, it soon became representative of only local interests and remained relatively unimportant. In 1914, the East Africa Indian National Congress was established in Mombasa and was modeled on the Indian National Congress. During the First World War, the militant anti-imperialist Gahadad Party established a branch in East Africa and attracted support from a number of the Asian community. The British authorities took a serious view of what they regarded as the Gahadad Party's political terrorism and sentenced a number of members to death for either belonging to the party or possessing seditious materials. By the early 1920s, there was a sizable Asian population who demanded a greater role in the developing political life of what became Kenyan colony. Racial hostilities gradually intensified in the 1920s. However, Indians who enjoyed significantly greater economic strength than black Africans had greater bargaining power with the colonial government. As early as 1920s, they turned down the official seats on the Legislative Council, as this was not representative of the size of their community. Tensions with Europeans remained high until 1927, when Indians won the right to 5 seats on the council, compared to the 11 reserved for the Europeans. Both parties prevented any African representation. After the Second World War, Asians were found in all occupations in Nairobi, in the townships, in business, police force, bureaucracy, and the professions. Their commercial skills contributed to the economic development and prosperity of Kenya and the rest of East Africa. In the 1950s saw increased sentiments against the inequalities of colonial rule, and many Asians were at the forefront of the push for increased rights. This included Payo Gama Pinto, founder of the Kenya African National Union newspaper, Makhan Sai, who is regarded as laying the foundations of Kenyan national trade unionism, and A.R. Kapila and Fitz de Souza, known in the legal profession for their representation of those accused of Mau Mau. By 1962, the Asian community had firmly established its dominance within the urban economy, despite accounting for only 2% of the overall population. They constituted 1/3 of the population of Nairobi, where their businesses dominated the main streets. Prior to independence, Asians owned nearly 3/4 of the private non-agricultural assets in the country. The Gujarati community, in particular, thrived in a wide range of industries. Some of the Kenyan's largest, most prominent companies to date are controlled by Gujaratis, including Comcraft Group, Manu Chandarai. Who is Manu Chandarai? Kenya achieved independence from the Britain in 1963 and thereafter followed a period of volatility in Africa and Asians' relations. Asians, along with Europeans, were given 2 years to acquire Kenyan citizenship and surrender their British passports. Out of approximately 180,000 Asians and 42,000 Europeans in Kenya at the same time, fewer than 20,000 had submitted their applications by the deadline. This, in turn, led by growing animosity and distrust from Africans. They considered those who failed to take up Kenyan citizenship as being disloyal. Those without Kenyan citizenship soon became subject to increasing discrimination by the ruling government led by Jomo Kenyatta. Despite the entrepreneurial success of the community in 1970, 70% of the economically active Asian population consisted of wage and salary earners, and 30% worked for civil service. A policy of Africanization meant many were sacked in favor of black Africans. The Kenya Migration Act 1967 required Asians to acquire work permits, whilst a Trade Licensing Act passed the same year limited the areas of the country in which non-Kenyans would engage in trade. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, faced with a dim future in Africa, many Asians chose to utilize their British passport and settled in the United Kingdom. Consequently, the Asian population in Kenya declined from 179,000 in 1962 to 139,000 in 1969 and to 79,000 in 1979. Asian migrants to the United Kingdom settled mainly in the English cities of London and Leicester.
But a more immediate problem faced the government on immigration. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta's drive to Africanize his country created a crisis for British subjects living there.
Towards the end of 1967, the heat was turned on the Asian community. Many Asians had retained British citizenship under the terms of the independence agreement. Kenyatta made them choose between becoming Kenya citizens or risk losing their jobs and trades.
When many Asians chose to come to Britain, certain politicians on the right immediately raised the alarm.
We are determined to preserve the British character of Britain. We welcome other races in reasonable numbers, but we have already admitted more than we can absorb.
The British government made a last-ditch attempt to persuade India to take the unwanted Kenyan Asians. A delegation was sent to Delhi.
This was in order to explore through the High Commission there with the Indian government whether they would be receptive to the idea of some of these Indian people going back to India. Going back is the wrong way of describing it, because most of them had never been in India, but they were Indian in origin, and they had as strong a connection with India as they did with the United Kingdom. But the Indian government, I think, with hindsight, quite understandably, felt that these were people who'd cast their lot in with Africa, and thereby with the United Kingdom, and that was where they should go.
This is a scene that's occurring almost every night at Nairobi Airport. Nearly 1,000 people a week, perhaps more than 1,000 a week, are now leaving Kenya for Britain. This is the Asian community, a community of which still about 125,000 people are entitled as British citizens to come to Britain.
But that entitlement was soon to be downgraded. Those Asians who hadn't set off for Britain were about to have their right to automatic entry dramatically and abruptly removed. In the last week of February 1968, Callaghan rushed through legislation that would keep the Asians out.
I remember getting home at 7:15 when my husband was asleep in bed. I flopped on the bed and said, "Ted, get me a cup of tea." And while he did, I dozed off for 3 minutes. Then I had to get up, have a bath, some breakfast and go to a cabinet meeting. Well, the awful thing was, I remember that in that cabinet meeting I struggled to keep awake. But it was Jim Callaghan droning on as Home Secretary. I just could not stay awake. That haunted me ever the rest of my cabinet life, the fact that I'd never fallen asleep in cabinet before. And to do it on that bill, I could see my enemies attacking me. She never said a word.
This march on Downing Street was one of the first repercussions against the government's plan to curb the entry of Asians from Kenya into Britain. They weren't all Asians who felt strongly opposed to the new policy, which is designed to control the flood of immigrants into a more easily absorbed, steady flow.
I thought it was a moral disgrace. Never mind race. It broke a pledge that we had given. I'm not in favour of governments breaking solemn pledges.
Wilson and Callaghan and the others panicked, and therefore they brought in this shameful piece of legislation, which was clearly racist in the sense that they weren't worried about an influx of white farmers from the Kenyan highlands. They were purely worried about Asians.
And other, more senior Conservatives were also uneasy.
I remember one night sort of walking up and down the lobbies in the House of Commons, agonising as to whether we were right to be prepared to go along with the Callaghan government, and which was the view of the shadow cabinet as a whole, or whether we ought not to stand out against it. And in the end, rightly or wrongly, we decided to fall in line.
There was outcry on the streets, but Labour ministers were still agonising over the right course of action.
I thought in principle it was the wrong thing to do because it flew in the face of our very serious Commonwealth obligations and indeed our international obligations generally. And therefore, for me as for others, it was a very, very painful business in the House of Commons at that time.
George Thompson was representing the difficulties that would arise. I wasn't unaware of the difficulties that would arise. We all were. We knew very well the difficulties. But there were also problems that we had to face here. And we had to balance those problems.
Shelley Williams and I spent the entire passage bill together, I was going to say moaning to each other, what do we do? And we went to see Jim Gallan twice and we talked about resigning.
Yet in the space of 72 hours, MPs pushed through a law that turned British passport holders from Kenya into second-class citizens.
Thousands of miles away in Nairobi, Kenya's capital, the Asian community prepared to leave. Britain was their destination. But the entry gates were quickly being closed.
British passport holder Babu Mehta's application to join his family and pregnant wife in Britain fell the wrong side of February 1968.
When I applied for the visa, they refused me. Said you can't join the family until you get your turn for the visa. So I had to stay back.
Babu Mehta was thrown into prison as an illegal immigrant after he tried to come to Britain anyway, but without the necessary papers.
So we were put all together with other criminals. There were 2 in rooms. We had to do toilet and everything in a room.
Eventually, the British authorities sent him back to Nairobi.
I went to Nairobi shortly after the legislation, and I saw the queues outside the British High Commission, which of course was a terrible sight for British citizens having to queue in all weathers in the street to try and get vouchers.
Babu Mehta was one of a group of Kenyan Asians who camped outside the British High Commission as a protest against Britain's refusal to honour their passports.
They all had a touching faith that we would honour the British passport that they got. And they found they were not being treated as they saw it fairly. And so they came and in many cases they camped outside my immigration office. And it was a very demeaning situation.
The reasons for refusing your application, which we are not prepared to discuss, reiterated that an entry certificate cannot be issued, and therefore I refuse your application. The matter is out of our hands.
Increasingly concerned about his wife's health, Babu Mehta wrote to the wife of one of the British officials, pleading with her to intervene with her husband. The High Commission deemed the letter offensive. Mehta decided to fly to London, even though he still didn't have the right entry certificate.
We went to Uganda, and from Uganda they sent us back again to Nairobi. And this time the Kenyan government didn't accept us. They sent us back to Entebbe. Entebbe they sent us back to Addis Ababa. And from Addis Ababa we went back to England. And from England they sent us back to Kenya. Again from Kenya, they didn't expect us, so they sent us back to London. Again, they sent us from London to Nairobi. And the last time they sent us back from Nairobi to London. And this time they accepted us.
Like Babu Mehta, British Asians from Kenya who wanted to come to Britain were often forced to wait, sometimes for years, just as the Act had intended.
I can only say that for me it was a trauma for the 36 hours. I should have resigned over the bill. I voted for a lot of things that the House of Commons I shouldn't have voted for. But that's what political life is like. There's only one I should have been so opposed to that I resigned, and it was that.
Some campaigners claimed that Babu Mehta would have been able to join his wife more easily if the Home Secretary had been Roy Jenkins.
I can't say for certain whether I would have introduced the bill. I'd have been very loath to do so. I was trying to grapple with what seemed to most people at the time to be the central thing threatening the life of the government, which was the balance payments economic subversion, the position of sterling. And I think I would have thought it was a little light-hearted to run away from that on a resignation of principle on the Kenyan Nation's bill, which indeed I had allowed to be prepared by officials. I think I said, go slow, try and avoid doing it, I don't like it, etc. But I didn't say more than that.
Determined to preserve the British character of Britain. We welcome other races in reasonable numbers, but we have already admitted more than we can absorb.
Going back to India, going back is the wrong way of describing it because most of them had never been in India, but they were Indian in origin, and they had as strong a connection with India as they did with the United Kingdom. But the Indian government, I think, with hindsight, quite understandably, felt that these were people who'd cast their lot in with Africa. And
But a more immediate problem faced the government on immigration. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta's drive to Africanize his country created a crisis for British subjects living there.
Towards the end of 1967, the heat was turned on the Asian community. Many Asians had retained British citizenship under the terms of the independence agreement. Kenyatta made them choose between becoming Kenya citizens or risk losing their jobs and trades.
When many Asians chose to come to Britain, certain politicians on the right immediately raised the alarm. The British government made a last-ditch attempt to persuade India to take the unwanted Kenyan Asians. A delegation was sent to Delhi.
this was in order to explore through the High Commission there with the Indian government whether they would be receptive to the idea of some of these Indian people.
Please like and subscribe to my channel for more videos and content like this. Asante sana, shukran.